European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen projected calm, authority, and control. That image, carefully built over years at the top of European power, shattered today. And the moment it shattered was caught on camera, in front of the world, and it is already being replayed in every newsroom on the planet. Von der Leyen panicked, publicly, visibly, unmistakably. In an emergency address that was called with less than 2 hours' notice, she stood before European press and delivered what can only be described as an alarm call, raw, urgent, stripped of the usual polished Brussels language. She warned that the NATO security shield that has protected Europe for 3/4 of a century is, in her words, no longer a certainty. She used the phrase existential moment. She called on European governments to act not in months, in days. And then she said something that no sitting European Commission president has ever said in the history of the institution, that Europe must now prepare for the possibility of defending itself without the United States. Without the United States. The room went silent. Journalists who cover Brussels for a living, people who have heard thousands of carefully managed political statements, sat in stunned quiet for several seconds before the questions erupted. Because what von der Leyen just said does not happen. European leaders do not say that. It breaks every diplomatic convention, every carefully maintained fiction of unbreakable transatlantic unity. And the fact that she said it anyway tells you everything you need to know about how serious this moment actually is. Stay with us, because what is collapsing right now has taken 80 years to build, and it is coming apart faster than anyone thought possible. To understand the scale of what von der Leyen just admitted, you need to understand what the NATO shield actually is, not as a political symbol, but as a physical operational system that keeps 32 nations secure every single day. NATO's deterrence model has always rested on one foundational assumption, that the United States is fully, unconditionally, and permanently committed to the collective defense of every member state. That assumption powers everything else. It is why a Russian military planner, before deciding to move forces toward a NATO border, has to calculate the risk of triggering not just a European response, but an American one, with all the overwhelming military capacity that implies. Remove that assumption even partially, even temporarily, and the entire deterrence model begins to lose structural integrity. It does not collapse immediately, but it develops fractures. And fractures, under pressure, become breaks. Those fractures have been developing for months. The Trump administration's repeated questioning of NATO's value, the freeze on elements of American military cooperation, J.D. Vance's public declaration that Europe is defenseless, the withdrawal of key intelligence sharing arrangements, each of these, individually, was damaging. Together, accumulated over weeks and months of relentless pressure, they have brought the NATO shield to the point where the woman who leads the executive arm of the European Union is now publicly acknowledging that it may not hold. What makes today's statement from von der Leyen historically unprecedented is not just what she said, it is that she said it at all. Brussels operates on a principle of managed messaging. You do not acknowledge structural weakness publicly, because acknowledgement itself accelerates the damage. The fact that von der Leyen broke that principle, that she chose transparency over managed calm, signals that behind the scenes, the assessment of how serious this crisis is has crossed a threshold. When the head of the European Commission tells you to panic, the situation has already gone past the point where pretending otherwise serves any purpose. Here is what the cameras did not fully capture from today's press conference, and it is the part of this story that changes everything. Before von der Leyen appeared in front of journalists, she convened a meeting, not a scheduled meeting, an emergency convening of the most senior European defense and foreign policy officials on the continent, pulled from their schedules with minimal notice, brought together in a session that lasted over 3 hours, and conducted under conditions of strict secrecy that have, in the hours since, begun to leak through the walls in the way that secrets always do when the people keeping them are frightened enough. What emerged from those leaks, confirmed by multiple European officials speaking anonymously to major news outlets, is a picture of a crisis that has moved significantly further than the public presentation has yet acknowledged. According to these sources, European intelligence agencies have detected a pattern of Russian military behavior over the past 72 hours that is being described internally as preparatory positioning, movements of forces, equipment, and logistical infrastructure in ways that do not constitute an imminent attack, but that reflect a Russian military taking advantage of perceived uncertainty in Western resolve to reposition for options it did not previously hold. In other words, Russia has already begun adjusting its posture in response to the visible cracking of the NATO shield. Not with aggression. Not yet. But with the kind of deliberate, calculated movement that every military analyst knows precedes something larger. It is the geopolitical equivalent of watching someone slowly pick up a weapon while watching to see if anyone will stop them. And the alarm inside European governments right now is driven by a fear that the answer to that question, will anyone stop them, has become suddenly and dangerously unclear. Von der Leyen knew this when she walked to that podium. She knew what the intelligence was showing, and she still chose to go public because the alternative, staying silent while Europe's adversaries read the situation as opportunity, was judged to be more dangerous than the diplomatic cost of breaking the illusion of managed control. What happens when 27 governments simultaneously realize that the security architecture they have relied on for their entire existence is no longer guaranteed? You are watching the answer to that question unfold in real time, and it is a response defined, above all else, by speed. European governments are moving faster than European governments are designed to move. The U is a consensus-based institution, slow, deliberative, built for stability and managed process rather than rapid crisis response. What is happening right now is the opposite of that. Emergency sessions are being called. Votes are being accelerated. Funding decisions that would normally take months of negotiation are being pushed through in days. And political leaders who have spent years disagreeing on almost everything are discovering a sudden and urgent common ground, the shared understanding that the continent is exposed, that the exposure is getting worse, and that the window for effective response is narrowing. The European Commission has activated emergency protocols around its defense investment framework, a mechanism that allows the EU to fast-track spending on defense capabilities in ways that bypass the normal budgetary approval process. Hundreds of billions of euros in new defense commitments are being discussed not as five-year plans, but as immediate priorities. European defense industry stocks, companies that manufacture everything from artillery shells to fighter aircraft to missile defense systems, surged dramatically as markets priced in the reality of a European defense spending boom-driven not by ambition, but by necessity. France and Germany, which have historically struggled to coordinate on defense issues due to differing strategic cultures and competing national interests, have begun what sources describe as unprecedented bilateral conversations about the possibility of a joint European deterrence framework. The centerpiece of those conversations, the element that would have been politically unthinkable just 6 months ago, is the question of French nuclear weapons. France is the only EU member state with an independent nuclear deterrent. Whether and how that deterrent might be extended to cover other European nations is a question that has historically been too politically sensitive to discuss openly. It is being discussed openly now. That alone tells you how dramatically the strategic landscape has shifted. The Trump administration's response to von der Leyen's emergency statement arrived within hours, and if European capitals were hoping for reassurance, what they received was the opposite. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, responding to reporters' questions about von der Leyen's comments, described the European reaction as hysterical and exactly the kind of European overreaction that demonstrates why the United States has been right to demand better burden sharing. She did not offer reassurance about American commitment to NATO. She did not walk back any of the previous statements by administration officials that have contributed to the current crisis. She doubled down, framing European panic not as a legitimate security concern deserving of engagement, but as evidence of a dependency problem that Europe needs to solve on its own. That response has produced a secondary explosion of reaction across Europe that in some ways dwarfs the original statement. Because what European leaders heard in the White House's reply was not negotiating posture. What they heard was clarity. The clarity that the current American administration genuinely does not view European security concern as its problem to manage, that the language of alliance partnership has been replaced by the language of commercial transaction, and that the relationship between Washington and its European allies has entered territory that has no modern precedent and no established playbook. Senior U officials speaking to European media in the hours after the White House response used language that represents a complete departure from the diplomatic norms of the transatlantic relationship. One described Washington's reply as the response of a superpower that has decided Europe is no longer a partner, just a client who has stopped paying. Another said flatly that the administration's attitude has destroyed the trust that took generations to build in a matter of months. These are not opposition politicians venting frustration. These are senior officials of the institution that has been America's closest global partner for 8 decades. While the political crisis plays out in capitals and conference rooms, it is worth stopping to remember what is actually at stake for the millions of ordinary people living in the nations most directly exposed by the weakening of NATO's shield. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have a combined population of roughly 6 million people. They share borders with Russia and Belarus. They have no strategic depth. Their territories are small enough that a determined military force could reach their capitals within hours. Their security has rested since they joined NATO in 2004 on the credibility of Article 5 and the visible presence of allied forces on their soil. Tonight, the leaders of all 3 Baltic states are publicly stating that they are reviewing their national emergency preparedness plans, not as a precaution, but as an operational necessity. Estonia's prime minister said that her government is no longer planning for crisis scenarios. We are planning for reality. In Poland, which has spent recent years building one of Europe's largest and best equipped military forces precisely in anticipation of a moment like this, the government has announced that it is accelerating the deployment of additional national forces to its eastern border with Belarus. Poland's defense ministry confirmed that these movements are directly responsive to the intelligence picture currently shared among European allies, the same intelligence picture that drove von der Leyen to her emergency press conference. In Germany, which carries enormous historical weight regarding questions of remilitarization, the political conversation has shifted with a speed that would have been unimaginable even 6 months ago. The Bundestag is holding emergency hearings. The Defense Ministry has requested emergency supplemental funding of a scale that exceeds anything Germany has committed to in the post-war era. And German public opinion, traditionally skeptical of military spending and deeply uncomfortable with anything that resembles pre-war nationalism, has shifted dramatically. Recent polling shows that a majority of Germans now support significant increases in defense spending, driven by a combination of fear, anger at Washington, and a recognition that the world they thought they lived in no longer exists in the form they believed it did. Nobody can tell you with certainty how this crisis resolves. But the shape of what comes next falls into 3 broad scenarios, and each of them carries consequences that will define European and global security for decades. The first scenario is de-escalation, Washington, reading the severity of European reaction and facing significant domestic political pressure from both Republican foreign policy hawks and Democratic critics, recalibrates. American officials begin quiet diplomatic outreach to NATO partners, offering reassurance and a pathway back toward the alliance's established cooperative frameworks. This scenario does not undo the damage. The trust that has been broken cannot be fully restored by a walk back, but it stops the bleeding and prevents the crisis from escalating into something irreversible. It is the scenario that European capitals are hoping for, while simultaneously refusing to depend on. The second scenario is acceleration. The current dynamic continues. Washington maintains its posture, European alarm grows, Russian probing behavior intensifies, and the alliance enters a prolonged period of structural uncertainty that fundamentally changes the security environment across the continent. In this scenario, Europe accelerates its independent defense build-out. The transatlantic relationship is permanently reconfigured from alliance partnership to something more transactional and conditional, and the world enters a new multipolar security environment without the guardrails that Western unity has provided since 1945. This scenario is not a catastrophe in the immediate term. It is a slow, grinding, enormously expensive, and deeply uncertain transition to an unknown new order. The third scenario is the one nobody wants to name, but everyone is thinking about. In this scenario, the visible weakening of NATO's shield, combined with intensifying Russian probing behavior, produces a miscalculation. Not necessarily a deliberate decision by Moscow to test the alliance with force, but an incident, a border violation, a confrontation that escalates faster than anyone intended, a moment where the ambiguity about American commitment collides with Russian opportunism. That forces the question of Article 5 into reality rather than theory. That scenario carries consequences so severe that European governments are currently doing everything possible to prevent it, while simultaneously, and for the first time seriously, planning for what they would do if it happens. Ursula von der Leyen did not want to stand at that podium today and say what she said. No leader in her position wants to publicly acknowledge that the security foundation their continent relies on is cracking. She did it because the alternative, silence in the face of a collapsing shield, was more dangerous than the truth. And the truth is this: the world that existed on January 1st of this year, a world in which American commitment to European security was the bedrock assumption of the entire Western order, is not the world that exists tonight. Something has shifted, something fundamental, something that cannot be shifted back simply by a change of tone or a reassuring phone call or a diplomatic statement carefully worded to paper over the cracks. What comes next will depend on choices made by leaders who are right now, in this moment, weighing options none of them expected to be weighing. It will depend on whether Moscow reads this moment as opportunity or as a warning about what European rearmament will ultimately produce. It will depend on whether Washington decides that the price of this confrontation is worth paying, or whether the cost to American influence, security, and global standing becomes too high to sustain. And it will depend on whether Europe, a continent that has spent 80 years choosing integration over independence, partnership over self-reliance, has the political will, the economic capacity, and the collective courage to do what von der Leyen said it must: stand on its own. History gave Europe a shield. Tonight, Europe found out the shield has cracks. What it builds to replace it and how fast it can build will define the next chapter of this continent's story and the security of every person living in it. Stay with us. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications, because this story will not pause for the weekend, and neither will we.